Good morning. If you have a Bible with you, I would love for you to turn with me now to Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. He also told them this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying in this manner: God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people. I'm not like other people, the thieves, the rogues, the adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me. I am a sinner. I tell you, Jesus said, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. And the moral of the story is this: don't be a self-righteous jerk that looks down on other people. Don't be a self-righteous jerk that looks down on other people. And the minute you say, I'm glad I'm not like that self-righteous jerk that looks down on other people, you become a self-righteous jerk that looks down on other people. That's the amazing point of this text, is that you see the man condemning the tax collector, but it's not that simple, because what Jesus is trying to expose us to is to expose us to the idea that we too are just like the Pharisee when we judge other people. And in the message today, what I want to talk about is superficiality. I want us to bless, to endorse, to embrace the idea that we do not have to bring a photoshopped life to church. That Christ is attracted to people who offer their real selves, their real lives, their real hearts, and say, here I am, just like everybody else, a sinner like everyone else. Here are 4 words I want you to remember today. You can write them down or just put them up here. We're going to repeat them several times. 4 words I want you to think about: curiosity, humility, honesty, and empathy. One more time: curiosity, humility, honesty, and empathy. In 1998, Richard Foster wrote a book called Celebration of Discipline. Celebration of Discipline is a book about sacred pathways to meeting and to knowing God. And what he does, it's kind of like a survey of all the classic spiritual traditions through the centuries that Christians have used and made a part of their life. It's a great book to have on your bookshelf. It's a book like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity that I continue to pull off the shelf every few years to dig into again, to remind myself of what is good and true and beautiful. And they're great books if you're just kind of stuck in your own life, that you can pull out and dig into and get a sort of a spiritual boost. The reason I mention Foster's book today is because it's where the idea for this fast from superficiality comes from. Because the very first sentence in the book, Foster says this about the world we live in. He said that our age, the curse of our age is superficiality. He says that we are a superficial people. He says we're superficial because we demand instant gratification. We never grow deep because we're always living hurried lives. And we don't access the depths of God and knowing other people fully because we're distracted people. He wrote that in 1998. And it couldn't be even more true today than it is. And what he said is, he said that what the world needs now is not people who are intelligent or gifted, but deep people. People who are real, people who are deep. And the reason he wrote this book is because these spiritual practices require focus, intentional effort, and discipline. And it's a great reminder for us that that's what this Lenten season essentially is all about. The Lenten season is a time to slow our life down, to pay attention and to focus, and to go deeper. The Lenten season is a season to deepen our lives by taking a look at those things in our lives that are superficial. The things that we need to let go of. The things that we need to change. I'm reminded of a story from the beginning of Luke's gospel, and you know the story. Simon Peter is on the shore, and he's mending his nets. He's been out all night fishing. And Jesus shows up and starts preaching a message. The crowd gets so big that Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Hey, can I borrow your boat for a moment? I'd like to use it as a floating pulpit." Simon Peter and Jesus get in the boat, and they push out a little bit from the shore, and they're in the shallow waters. He's preaching a message about the kingdom of God. He finishes the message, and then he looks at Peter and he says, "Peter, let's push out of the shallow water and into the deep water, and let's let down our nets for a catch." Now, you should know, if you've spent any time reading the Bible, that a story like that is always about the actual event and something deeper, actually. It's more than a fishing story. What is Jesus saying to Peter? Jesus is saying to Simon Peter, "Hey, you've been living your life, this sort of shallow life over here, and I'm not faulting you for it, but I'm inviting you to go on a journey with me, onto a deeper journey, to a deeper world, to a deeper way of understanding me, the world, and all the beauty of God has in mind for you." And that's the beginning of his journey. In 1980, I was a freshman student at TCU in my freshman year. And I grew up in a Christian church, Disciples of Christ, just like this church. And I had a very broad understanding of Christianity. I was taught that there were different ways to look at the world and to think about the world. But I grew up in a very small environment, and I grew up in Texas, and this one way of thinking about the world. And all of a sudden, I go and I'm exposed to these Harvard-educated Bible teachers and teaching about the Hebrew Scriptures of the New Testament. And I got to tell you, it was scary to me. Because all of a sudden I was learning stuff I didn't know. I thought I was going there to be taught what to think, not how to think. And I found myself really struggling. You should see an 18-year-old argue with an Old Testament professor who's been educated at Harvard. It didn't go very well. So I remember one night, I'm laying on my dorm room bed, I'm looking up at the ceiling, and I'm thinking, "God, is all this stuff true? Is there so much more to the Bible than I ever imagined? Is there more to the world than Texas and Bedford, Texas, the cultural hotspot of the universe?" And I remember thinking to myself, there's got to be more. And so I faced a choice. Do I just retreat into this very small way of thinking, or do I just launch out into the deep? And I surrendered. And in my whole life in faith, it's about surrendering to going to deeper, because there's always more. You know, Walter Brueggemann is a Hebrew Bible professor, and Brueggemann says that the spiritual life can be defined, or any life, defined by three phases. He says there's orientation, which is when life is good and everything is going along well. Orientation is when you're living your life and everything's just clicking along great. And he says that almost always we enter into a period of disorientation. Anything could cause disorientation: illness, sickness, loss of a job, a pandemic, a global pandemic. Disorientation is when the thing that we are standing on, the ground we're standing on, and the things that we believe kind of crumble around us, and we have to think differently because everything's coming apart. The danger in a time of disorientation is that we want to go back to the old life and to hold on to old things, to our certainty. But Brueggemann says that God uses disorientation to take us to deeper places, to newer things. And it's the third phase, is reorientation. The reason I share that with you is because what has this last year been? This last year has been a year of disorientation. Now, I would never claim that God gave us COVID or any of these things to teach us a lesson, but in everything that happens in life, God is always working for the good of all things, for all things. And so God has used this season, I think, to expose to us the ideas that maybe the way that we've been living may be rather superficial. Maybe some of our understandings of who God is and what God is about, maybe they're rather superficial. And I think that God has used this season to ask us to go to a deeper place. Don't go back to the way your life was before this season. Go to the new place that God has taken you. Focus your life on the things that are truly important and that matter. I think that you're longing, like all of us, for something deeper. So what is the antidote to superficiality? How do we go deeper? Back to the 4 words I mentioned earlier. The first word is the word curiosity. I think that it begins by cultivating the virtue of curiosity. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say before that Christians, one of the top Christian virtues should be curiosity. I don't know if I've heard that before. I'm sure it's not an original idea. But I think, if anything, we should be described as a curious people. Sometimes we're labeled as people who live in a box, who see the world from a very narrow point of view, and we get that reputation deservedly so. But I think that we should be curious because we serve and love an infinite God who is beyond all human understanding. And so I think that means that we should be curious enough to learn different ways of thinking about the Bible instead of just the way that we've always been taught to think about it, to be open to new ideas and different interpretations. I think that we should be curious about learning from people who belong to different Christian faith traditions. We can learn something from everyone. In fact, this week on Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing Darren Spoo from First Baptist Church on Wednesday, 6 o'clock. We can learn something from different religious traditions. We can even learn things from people who belong to completely different religions. I preached a sermon one time, and it was one of the most beloved sermons I've ever preached. It was called What I Learned About God from a Buddhist. It was about my experience in a Buddhist camp one summer. But that sermon was also one of the most intensely disliked sermons I ever preached. But in the sermon, I thought it was a great idea because I was saying we can learn something in every single human being, regardless of what religion. We can find the sacred in every person, and there's value to learning from others. And I learned a lot about how I saw God from listening to a person from a completely different world. We ought to be curious about learning from people who have different experiences than us. You see, the problem is we all live in these little bubbles, don't we? These little bubbles. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ bubble, the Baptist bubble, the Lutheran bubble, the Fox News bubble, the CNN bubble. We're all siloed in all these little bubbles. White people bubble. I mean, we just live in all these little bubbles, and we never leave our bubbles. And we become, even though we're the most, we know more about the world than any time in human history, we've never become more siloed and more bubbled. But the thing I love about Jesus didn't live in a bubble. Jesus experienced all kinds of people and never lived in a bubble. I think the calling, if we are to go deeper and to leave behind superficiality, means we're going to have to be exposed to people who are different from us and leave our little bubbles. The problem with the man in the story was he lived in a little Pharisee bubble. And when he looked at the man, all he could see was tax collector, his stereotype of who he thought the man was. That leads to the second antidote for superficiality, and is the antidote of humility. I think that in order to go deeper and to leave superficiality behind, we just need to admit, I don't know everything I need to know. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And you can't learn anything if you think you've got it all figured out, if you think you've got the whole world tied up in a box. The problem with the man in the text, listen to his prayer. It wasn't a prayer. All he was doing was reciting his religious credentials. I'm this. He says, I, like 6 times. The beautiful thing about the tax collector was, who is the honored man in the text, as he just says, I'm a sinner. This is just me. I think to go deeper, we got to be willing to admit that we're not at the center of the universe and humble ourselves. The third thing is honesty. God doesn't want you to live a photoshopped, auto-tuned life. This text shows us that Jesus is attracted to people who are real, who don't hide behind their religion. You know, it's true, isn't it? It is so much easier to focus on the faults and the weaknesses of other people than it is to focus on our own selves and the work that we're called to do. You can't go deeper if you're not willing to be real. You can't go deeper as long as you think you're better than someone else. Honesty. This should be a place where we're able to say, God, this is just who I am. This is just me. You should be able to walk in these doors and not wear your social status on your sleeve, not hide behind your work, but be real before God. And those 3 things, the reason I list those 3 things is an antidote for superficiality, curiosity, humility, and honesty, because it produces a trait in people. It produces a trait that is sorely lacking in the world today, and it is the trait of empathy. Everybody's divided in their own little bubbles with no care or concern to know their neighbor. To leave behind superficiality, to be honest and to be humble and to be curious means I'm going to try to know who that. I'm not going to look at people from the point of view of their labels. And it's going to produce empathy into me. To try to understand why a person is the way they are. To understand that I'm no different than anybody else, no matter what they do or where they are. And every single one of us, we should all recognize that we all stand before God in the same way, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. No one is righteous. And that kind of humility and that kind of honesty allows us to get the work done that we need to do, and allows us to truly see and love our neighbor in the way that Jesus wants us to love our neighbor. There's another story right after this one. A rich man approaches Jesus and says, Jesus, it's clear you got it going on. What's going on? That's my interpretation of the text. You got it going on. What I need to do to live the life that you're living, and I want this good life you're talking about. And Jesus looks at him and nails him on his superficiality. Hey, again, my interpretation. You built your whole life on your stuff and your possessions and your career. I want to take you someplace deeper. And for that to happen, you got to leave all that stuff behind instead of clinging on to the stuff that gave you your identity. And what does the man do? He faces a choice. It says he chooses not to go deeper, but to hold on. To hold on to his old way of life. Every single day that you get up out of bed, you're given an invitation. to move toward a deeper life, to be the people that Christ is calling you to be. And that sometimes means letting go of old things. But what a joy. What a wonderful thing. I'll never regret the decision I made to listen to my Harvard-educated Hebrew Bible teacher. Amen.